I wanted to start with that reference there to the financial crisis, given, of course, you were at the helm of the Bank of England at the peak of it. Clearly, there's a very different cause to this crisis, but are there similarities, and which do you think is the bigger threat to economic growth?
So I think there are two similarities. It's a global crisis that makes it much more difficult for us to pretend that the rest of the world can help one country in trouble. And secondly, that what will happen in the next few months will depend critically on people's behavior. Just as it was difficult to predict which funds would be withdrawn from banks and financial institutions in the financial crisis, so now an awful lot will depend on the behavior of people, whether they abide by the advice they're being given by governments, and how companies will respond to the enormous uncertainty that lies ahead.
And is it a bigger threat to the outlook for the economy than 2008 and 2009 was?
Well, I think it's very different. I think that it was a lot easier to handle the crisis in 2008 because we knew what we were up against. And once the banking system had been recapitalized and people had come to terms with the fact that that was what was necessary, then the crisis abated, and the banking crisis at least then went away. I think this is much more difficult because we are in a situation where, for very good reasons of combating the health crisis and reducing the number of fatalities, governments around the world are deliberately pushing the world economy down. And this will undoubtedly be a very major factor in people's decisions looking ahead. It is vital, therefore, I think, that governments do two things at present. One is immediately to deal with the cash flow problems that result from people's cash takings disappearing overnight. That is the sort of measure that the Fed can help with. But the second measure is to assure people that there will be compensation from the government to compensate businesses, both large and small, and the self-employed, for the fact that their incomes have simply fallen away. And it is vital that governments put that in place in principle as soon as possible, even if they may take a little time to work out the details of how it would be done. Otherwise, what you will find is massive layoffs, falls in spending, which will exacerbate the problem that we face now.
Lord King, we have seen all sorts of actions from governments and central banks around the world. I mean, I think you could legitimately say that they have reached the sort of whatever it takes mantra and have done so very quickly. Have you been surprised how quickly central banks have managed to respond to this versus whether it's the sovereign debt crisis 2010 to 12 or the financial crisis 2008, 2009?
So I think one of the important things to recognize here is that each country on its own realizes it's facing a national crisis. And that has made it much easier for governments to respond to its own circumstances than to deal with issues that span across nations. The euro area is facing a very big challenge, and governments are not finding it easy to come together to find a solution. The nation state here is acting quickly to deal with its own citizens. I'm not surprised that central banks have responded so quickly, because I think the lessons of the financial crisis were clear, and I think central banks have a history and a track record of cooperating together and of being willing to act quickly and speedily. Many of the facilities that are being opened up again now are things that were created in the first instance in the financial crisis. So we've learned from the past and we've built on it. I think the bigger challenge now is for governments. Central banks cannot make promises of compensation from the collective citizenry to individual businesses, but that is what is necessary now. I think the idea that we would just let businesses fail because they're facing a serious shock now, which has been imposed on them by governments for very good reasons to deal with the crisis of the coronavirus, but it was no fault of these businesses that their businesses now seem to be incapable of continuing without government support. That government support is crucial. That support can then be withdrawn when the epidemic disappears and we can go back to the market economy as usual. But we're not in that position now.
It's Sarah, Lord King. Thanks for joining us. You know, right now it's all about a fix. It's responding to crisis. It's throw everything you have at it. But I'm just wondering, you know, with the Fed throwing its arsenal behind the funding markets and the credit markets and zero interest rates, how do you think about the long-term impact of some of these policies when we do hopefully get back to normal?
So again, I'd like to take it in two steps. One is the credit facilities, the lending supported by central banks, and the other is the solvency business, the compensation which governments, I think, need to offer. On the first, central banks will be able to reverse these policy stimuli very quickly when it seems appropriate to do so. And I think that the epidemic will go away at some point, and then the central banks will be able very quickly to reverse some of the measures they put in place. I think on the compensation front, it's more difficult, because unless we put these measures in place now, then I think we may have a sharply reduced business sector to support the long-run growth of the economy. And I think the immediate need is for governments to act as a purchaser of last resort. We don't need just credit, we need more than that. And if the government is a purchaser of last resort, it can say to businesses, look, these are the takings that you expected to receive over the next few months, and we will ensure that the government provides you with those takings, or at least some proportion of them, maybe 80 or 90%, so that you then don't have to lay off workers. Indeed, a condition of the grants would be that they not lay off workers, and that people can maintain their jobs even though they are confined to their homes at present. And if we don't do that, then I think we could see very serious long-run damage to the economy. But I do think that whatever measures are put in place, it will actually be relatively straightforward to unwind them. What will be more difficult is if we allow this to cause serious damage now, and to try to repair that damage later may be very difficult. And there will be changes in the pattern of the economy looking ahead. We have no idea how far international travel will continue in the way that it did in the past. We don't know whether people's travel preferences will be the same. Their methods of working may change. And these will have consequences for businesses, and some businesses will disappear and other businesses will be created. But this is not the moment to allow that to happen. This is the time to support current businesses, and then once the epidemic is over, then we can let the market economy sort out the allocation of resources among different parts of the economy in the usual way.
Lord King, whilst we've been speaking, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has put the UK into a lockdown, including, by the way, banning gatherings of more than 2 people.
To reduce the transmission of the virus in the short run, what we don't know are really 2 very important things. One is how long will people be able or willing to put up with these extraordinary restrictions, and will they work effectively? I mean, how will people get food, for example? Will they be able to go to shops? I have not seen the precise statement that he made in the last few minutes. This interview coincided with Boris Johnson's statement. But that's one big question. How will people respond and react to these measures? For how long can they seriously be maintained? And the second question is, we don't really know what the exit strategy is from all this. Will it be the case that if we are successful in containing the virus in the short run, the population will then be exposed to the risk of a second or third wave of the virus down the road once the restrictions come to an end? And the exit route from the epidemic, really, that we can be confident will work, is essentially a vaccine. And that sadly seems further away than most of us are able to think at this stage.